Welcome to Newsnight Global from Sri Lanka. We're in Colombo at a time of great economic and political peril for this country, and tonight we'll be joined by political leaders, activists, international funders and artists to ask what the future might bring and what lessons can be learned for other nations facing the prospect of a looming financial collapse. Good evening from the National Museum in Colombo. On Newsnight Global tonight, politics and protest here in Sri Lanka. There are many countries around the world, from Ghana to Pakistan to El Salvador, nervously watching what is happening in this debt-distressed country. In the last 12 months, Sri Lanka has faced unprecedented turmoil. It's battled rampant inflation, a debt time bomb, and the tearing of the constitutional fabric with a popular uprising called the Aragala, the word for struggle in the Sinhala language, which culminated in the storming of the presidential palace and a change in government in the summer. All this against the backdrop of the pandemic and the impact of the war in Ukraine. The next weeks are critical as the IMF holds back a bailout until stringent conditions are agreed, and China and India eye up the Sri Lankan economy as an opportunity. Tonight, we'll be examining that tug of war. So what and who can revitalize Sri Lanka, once one of the world's greatest tourist destinations? And could political change stop the potentially devastating brain drain which is growing daily? First tonight, we're joined by the leading opposition MP and former banker, Iran Wickramathanathi, and he is a former finance minister. Ambika Satunanatha is the Sri Lankan former commissioner for human rights. And Gianna De Zoysa is an environmentalist and activist who's been at the heart of the movement that led to the summer uprising. Well, good evening to you. Iran, first of all, since the revolution, do you think have things got better? Because, there's a question of the government possibly delaying elections and an economy cut by 10% since last summer.
I wouldn't say that things have got better. Things have got better in the sense of, people were on the streets waiting 3-4 days to get their gas or to get their petrol, and that has eased off, not because we are getting more gas or petrol, but there's a coupon system. So now you get 20 liters of petrol, for example, and you would go once a week to get it. So you don't have to be in a queue for 3 or 4 days. So it's not that things have got better, but that has eased by just a bit better planning. The fundamentals of the economy have not changed, even after the change of the president.
So if the fundamentals of the economy haven't changed, what do you need for them to change?
Yeah, so we've been saying for quite some time that there has been fiscal indiscipline. Sri Lanka's revenue should be more like 18% of GDP, and it's only 8% of GDP. When the government took over, it was at 13% of GDP, and it just collapsed because of wrong policies and very poor management. And then that crisis developed into not just a budget deficit issue, it became a balance of payments issue, and basically a lack of dollars, so we can't really get the essentials.
So it's a perfect storm. Just turning to you, Gianna, your life turned upside down during the uprising. You were a safari guide, you're a model, you're an environmentalist. Then you were at the heart of the protest, and to a certain extent these other jobs have done. And now the Prevention of Terrorism Act has been used to clamp down on demonstrations. We saw that. Do you think there's actually less freedom than there was before the uprising?
I would definitely say that the new president coming in did mark a new wave of oppression against the activists and the protesters. As you just mentioned, we had people being arrested as terrorists under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. The convener of the Inter-University Students Federation, Vasantha Mudalige, is still in detention as of today.
For how long?
146 days. And then we have the British national Kayleigh Fraser, who has been in hiding in fear of persecution for the last 4 months
Because she took part in the protest.
because she posted a few videos to her social media, essentially. And every attempt for the citizens of this country to exercise their right to peaceful assembly and protest has been met with violence and hostility by the police.
But is it fair to say that not all the protesting, and we saw that from last summer, was peaceful? You know, there was violence, there was disruption, there was also destruction. Is it fair to say that perhaps the government can't be sure that things have moved to a stage where there is actually going to be a dialogue from your side as well?
Just to answer on the first thing that you mentioned there, I think any form of violence or destruction that did actually come from the protesters was justified after months of calling for the same demands that were not being answered. But a lot of that was also set up by the government.
Ambika, from your point of view, you are a human rights activist, but also professional. Was it all worth it?
I would say that protest and citizen mobilization is always worth it. And in Sri Lanka, protests of this nature were unseen because usually protests were organized by political parties or trade unions, and this time there were citizens on the street.
And young people in particular,
And
and
young
women.
Exactly. So I think in that sense, there was a shift in the democratic or the conscience or the sense of civic consciousness of the public. For that moment, I think it happened. So therefore, I would say it was definitely worth it. But did we actually capitalize on it? Did we take it further? That is the question that we must ask. And also in relation to oppression, we've always had oppression. That is part of our history, and different groups have been oppressed historically. The upcountry Tamils, the Tamils. Therefore, it was not new, but perhaps also the southern public was feeling the crisis, the economic crisis.
So, the Paksa brothers, who ran the country and controlled 70% of the economy before they were forced to flee, have been sanctioned this week for human rights violations by the Canadian government, to the anger actually of the Sri Lankan government. There's talk of them trying to return to power. Do you think that is possible?
Well, definitely there is not only talk, but they are preparing. That is because also they have a sense of entitlement. And we can see that they are, and they have been trying their usual tactic, which is inciting hatred against ethnic minorities, Muslims, etc. And we see that happening even now. The Sinhala Buddhist nationalist rhetoric coming up again.
Is it possible that Paksa brothers could return?
Certainly not in the short term.
In the short term?
Yeah, because people have rejected them. They have been sent home. And it is just impossible. Of course, they will attempt to come back. That's a different story. Always they will attempt to come back. I mean, if you just mentioned about the Canadians,
yes,
right, having an embargo on them coming there or assets being moved. What's the problem? If some country doesn't want me to come there, I have no problem with it. But if I have legitimately got assets somewhere, I will go to the courts of those countries and get my assets. If I have illegitimately got it, only I have to get excited about it. So this is just ridiculous.
Now, a lot of young people are saying a plague in all your houses. Is there enough transparency in the political system in Sri Lanka?
No, I won't say that there is enough transparency. Democracy in Asia is basically once in 5 years or 4 years going to the polling station and basically putting your cross and voting somebody in. In the Asian context, not only in Sri Lanka, party politics, within parties, there is no internal democracy. So democracy is redefined in Asia as opposed to in some other parts of the world.
Thank you all very much indeed. Well, 2023 has been dubbed the year of recovery by the government here, but is that optimism misplaced? In September, after declaring bankruptcy earlier in the year, Sri Lanka reached an agreement in principle with the IMF for a $3 billion bailout that was supposed to have been finalized by the end of 2022. First, that deadline moved to the end of this month, But now there's talk of significant further delay. Why? Well, partly that's because of a standoff. The country's major creditors, China and India, have to agree to write down the value of Sri Lankan debt before the IMF will release the money. But neither country wants to blink first. Here's Ben on how Sri Lanka has found itself trapped between two superpowers.
This enormous tower in the shape of a lotus was built in the centre of Colombo with Chinese investment cash before the economic crisis engulfed Sri Lanka. It's become quite literally a landmark of Chinese influence on this island. The International Monetary Fund has agreed a $3 billion bailout to help the Sri Lankan people. Yet the bailout money won't actually arrive until China agrees to a restructuring of its $7 billion of loans to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's central bank governor admits the agreement is taking longer than hoped.
When we thought we should be able to get the assurances within about 3 months, so that we were hoping to get the program unlocked from the IMF somewhere in December. For whatever reason that there was a delay, the sooner they give us financial assurances, that would be better for both, as a creditor, as a debtor. That will help for us to start repaying their obligations sooner than later.
Newsnight was here 6 months ago investigating the reality of Chinese investment in this country. Cricket stadiums, hospitals, airports. China has also made sizable loans to many other developing countries. Beijing is believed to be anxious about the precedent a Sri Lanka debt restructuring will set. But the US ambassador to Sri Lanka today warns China's prevarication on debt restructuring is now harming the country.
Beijing has said they are a friend of Sri Lanka, and I'm sure the Sri Lankan people would love to see that turn into action and make sure that there is not a delay and that Beijing really responds quickly without delay in terms of providing those financial assurances. Sri Lanka does not have time to delay. They need these assurances immediately. And we've seen again delays in Zambia and Chad and other countries where for one reason or another it's been held up. And China has been the spoiler. So again, for the sake of the Sri Lankan people, we certainly hope the PRC is not a spoiler as they proceed to attain this IMF agreement.
Yet, it's more complicated than just waiting for China. Another stakeholder looms large over this land.
This rubble over here, this is going to be a new container terminal operated by a Chinese company. But if we swing round here, just a few hundred meters across the water, we can see land which is being reclaimed for another container terminal, but this one will be operated by an Indian company. These two nations are also competing in other ports around Sri Lanka for investment. And what all this illustrates is that these two new Asian superpowers are vying for influence on this island, not only over the country's politics, but its infrastructure as well.
Sri Lanka also needs India, another major lender to the country, to agree to write down its loans to unlock the IMF bailout. And here some see geopolitics as the barrier, and the question of who will have the most influence over the Sri Lanka that ultimately emerges from this crisis.
It's a preoccupation here, this constant battle for influence. I think every player, big or small, recognizes that Sri Lanka has a fantastic advantage in terms of location, strategic location, in terms of transshipment routes. So there is logic in that interest, but we know when big players like India and China come in, it's more than just the logistics of it. It's definitely strategic. I think there is this wait and watch approach. Every step taken now could have a bearing on what happens later to the individual relationship that these countries have.
At Sri Lankan weddings, traditional local folk dances often open the ceremony. But this troupe of dancers told us they are nearly always asked to put on an Indian Bollywood show too. So this is the complex dance in which Sri Lanka finds itself involved. Its immediate future and recovery seems blocked, or at least held up, by one of the big geopolitical power rivalries of the 21st century between China and India. And other smaller countries might find themselves in a similar position in the coming years if they too follow Sri Lanka into default.
We look for more coordination within the international community, not less, as we look towards how we can support countries in debt distress, help them get back on their feet, but in a way that the reforms will be long-lasting and not returning to the same cycle of debt distress that we've seen everywhere.
Long queues at the Colombo Immigration Office are a sure indication of a still badly ailing economy.
This is what can happen when a country's economy implodes. You get mass economic migration. A record 311,000 Sri Lankans left the country last year. And this emigration has actually been encouraged by the country's president. He wants Sri Lankans like these to leave the country, earn foreign currency and send it back to Sri Lanka so the country can afford vital food and medicine supplies. So tell us about where you and your family would like to go.
The UK, because my cousin is there. She's in Kent, so I'm planning to move there for the moment. And I hope she will help me to find a place. Since I have 2 kids, it's very young, I don't want them to suffer anymore in this country.
Hopefully, we are looking at New Zealand, Australia or UK.
Would you prefer to stay in Sri Lanka ideally?
Yeah, definitely, because here we are more stabilized. We have our families, cousins, to friends, to everyone. So if we are moving to another country, definitely we have to start from the very beginning.
The emigration of these skilled workers could benefit Sri Lanka in the short term, but many fear the longer term scarring effects will be deep. And so, Sri Lanka is a country that finds itself waiting for geopolitical rivalries to allow it to recover. Waiting for the chance to leave this crisis behind.
We'll be hearing again from Ben in a moment. Let's speak now to Haran Fernando, Sri Lanka's Tourism and Land Minister. Minister, thanks very much for joining us. It's not just about economic regeneration, it's about trust in government, and it's about the social fabric of the country. And if all these people are leaving and your president is saying, you know, young professionals go away, earn lots of money and send it back, that's not good for Sri Lanka, is it?
Well, absolutely it's not. But what do we do on short term? I mean, just looking at what Ben's presentation was, it's clear that we need a short-term win, and how do we stand up as a country. What we went through last 6 months, or what we have gone through over the years, we need to rectify it short, mid, and on long term.
But you've got poor people on limited, expensive fuel, and also houses dark at night. And you've got the Lotus Tower, paid for by the Chinese, lit up like a beacon. I mean, that's a terrible contradiction, isn't it?
I'm somebody who was very critical about the former government as well. But what do we see right now about Sri Lanka? How do we overcome? One of our main source of revenue is foreign remittances, number 1. Number 2 is tourism. And number 3 is apparel exports. If you want to attract people, Sri Lanka has to be normal. And Sri Lanka has to be shown normal on a marketing context.
Let's talk a little bit about the government, because you have said that you would like to leave by August because the concept of Sri Lankan politics is wrong, divided by race, religion and ethnicity.
Agreed.
If that doesn't change, is government doomed? And in fact, what will you do?
Well, what I would say is, as I said again, what we went through 6 months ago, we needed some stability in Sri Lanka. And you see it to yourself. You're here in Sri Lanka. You see Sri Lanka does not, on the outside, looks terrible. We needed it to look normal. We needed to start moving, and then we need to make the changes.
But is there too much repression? You've got the Prevention of Terrorism Act being used to stop peaceful demonstrations. We saw 50 or so people and more than 100 police officers and army on what was a beach cleanup.
Okay. So see, when you talk about Prevention of Terrorism Act, that is something that have been happening over the period of time. My personal opinion could be very different. I would not like it. I was supposed to be arrested under PTA few months back before this particular new government came in. So I do understand it's a draconian sort of a law that is in Sri Lanka, but it's contradictory. Sometimes there are so many terrorism things that's happening. We've got warnings, and then the international community wants the terrorism to be controlled, and then they again say the PTA is not the right way to go forward. But what's wrong is using PTA for wrong reasons. That's where the problem is, whether you're going to use it for oppression.
Well, you know, you've got other countries watching what's going on in Sri Lanka. You have got the IMF bailout not coming through yet. And we had Standard Chartered Bank today saying given delays in securing financial assurances from creditors, we expect the restructuring deal only at the end of 2023. That is just an assessment by one bank. But if you don't get that bailout to the end of this year, what happens?
As you can clearly see, Sri Lanka is sandwiched between few superpowers in the world. And when you're a nation like that, those are the challenges. The geopolitics would always come into play. This is where you need strong leaders, somebody who can actually handle the situation. And I think at this given context, there's no other better person to handle the situation. And that's what we had to move into a government, have a president to control this situation, get people into normalcy, and then go for the democratic process of elections.
Just on that, very quickly on that point, is there any question of delaying the elections?
Well, I'm not so sure, but...
You're a minister.
But I would say only one thing. It's about a 10 to 15 billion cost for Sri Lanka for an election. That's our entire harvest. That's our entire harvest. No, I'm just saying.
But I mean, the cost of not doing it is democracy.
I'm for elections. I'm for elections. But what I'm saying is whether the 90% of the people in the country is asking for election is a questionable.
Sri Lanka had to default on its sovereign debt, and other countries are looking very closely at Sri Lanka. What can they learn from Sri Lanka's mistakes?
There's quite a lot that they can learn. Spending too much than what you earn is the biggest problem. And I think we
not a good taxation system, not good fiscal discipline.
Probably our taxation was completely wrong. We didn't identify ourselves. I would just say, since I'm the tourism minister, Sri Lanka could have just been a tourism nation alone, could have got us out of this rut. But we were investing on completely different projects and not identifying what our potential was. So I think that's one of the biggest things that people or the world should learn. What are our strengths and what are our weaknesses, and how do we plan ourselves? So I don't think Sri Lankan politicians really did plan for the last 74 years.
Hareen Fernand, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, of course, what happens here is, as we say, being closely watched by developing nations across the world. The economic shockwave caused by the coronavirus still reverberates, and for poorer countries, the extra borrowing to try to deal with that has created a troubling international picture. Economists are increasingly concerned that the debt risk in as many as 20 countries other than Sri Lanka could lead to a crisis like the one we've seen here. Here's Ben again to examine the global debt trap.
Sri Lanka has gone over the edge, but the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are warning it is unlikely to be the last country to do so. Around 60% of low-income countries are estimated to be in debt distress, meaning they face punishingly high interest rates and a high perceived risk of debt default. All of these countries have been hit by a triple whammy of global shocks. First, the pandemic. Second, the global inflationary impact of the invasion of Ukraine. Third, rising global interest rates. Just how many people around the planet could this affect? The answer is a lot, some 900 million. So what is the big picture? Well, after defaults in Sri Lanka, Zambia, Russia, and in December in Ghana, market attention in terms of default risk has turned to places such as Egypt, Tunisia, El Salvador, Pakistan, and many more. And the World Bank is warning of a train wreck, and too little too late, on international coordination for the restructuring of the debt of these vulnerable states. Coordination which it insists is vital to prevent an economic and social disaster engulfing these countries in a similar way to Sri Lanka.
So the IMF is a critical player here and elsewhere. Mark Flanagan is the Deputy Director of the IMF Strategy, Policy and Review Department. I spoke to him a little earlier, and I began by asking him if he thought other countries could follow Sri Lanka into default.
Many countries have emerged from the pandemic with higher fiscal deficits that have driven higher and rising debt ratios. There's a big chunk of debt service coming due for a lot of the lower middle income countries over the next 5 years because they did a lot of borrowing back in the last decade. They face constraints on their fiscal adjustment because many of them are poor and have many needs to fulfill. And, you know, they're just one shock away from being tripped up and forced into a default situation.
So one shock away, we've seen the humanitarian crisis here in Sri Lanka. People can't even buy eggs, they're too expensive. Fishermen are paying 4 times as much for their fuel in uncertain waters as well. If that humanitarian crisis was to cascade through other countries, what would the scale of it be? And would it be something we really haven't seen in modern times?
Well, okay, the first thing I want to emphasize is right now we're not predicting a cascade of sovereign defaults. It's a possibility if things go wrong in the global economy, but it's considered a risk right now. More likely we're going to see a situation over the next couple of years, like we've seen in the last few years, where we have a few countries a year enter into debt distress situations. It is an important risk, though. I want to emphasize that. If things do go wrong in the global economy, and the kind of scenario we worry about is a situation where we see a sequence of continuing supply shocks, forcing inflation up, forcing tight interest rates in advanced economy central banks, lowering growth. And if you see that kind of an outcome, then you might actually see this risk scenario arise. One way to think about this, in fact, about the total exposure is to think about the most vulnerable, those who are subject to extreme food insecurity. And we have estimates on that from the World Bank, from UN agencies. And right now, those estimates say that between 700 and 1 billion people over the next decade are exposed to extreme food insecurity. Those are the kind of people who would be very affected by a debt crisis. So you're looking at a good chunk of the global population who would be exposed, maybe 10%. It's a really troubling scenario, and one, of course, that at the IMF we really very much want to avoid and help our members avoid that.
We've spoken to the American ambassador here in Sri Lanka, and her observation is that China just owns too much of the debt. The ambassador seems to be suggesting China's just got to get on with it about making decisions about restructuring so that Sri Lanka can start to work its way out of this. China's concern is, you give favorable terms to Sri Lanka, you'll be required to give favorable terms in all the other countries in which you're a creditor.
We have to remember some of these creditors like China are themselves lower middle income countries. I think we fully understand why creditors face very difficult situations. At the same time, what we know from history, if you're a creditor and a country can't repay you, dragging it out actually makes it worse. That's what we can see from the numbers, and a ton of research that has gone into this. Delayed restructurings that are too little raise the economic costs for the debtor country and actually reduce the ultimate recovery for creditors. So it's very important for creditors to reconcile themselves to the fact that they did lend in good faith. You mentioned the possibility, the risk of a sovereign debt crisis earlier. It's actually even more important when you get multiple cases out there for creditors to find efficient processes to deal with these situations and to help countries find their way through. The more countries we see globally experiencing these kind of stresses that aren't relieved of them in a timely manner, the worse it is for the global economies.
And finally, just on the question of Sri Lanka, I know there has been a delay in the bailout so far. People are very hopeful that will be resolved. But can you give us any time frame? And are you confident, are you hopeful that we will see a resolution of this in Sri Lanka in the coming weeks?
We agreed some time ago on a policy program with the Sri Lankan authorities. Now we need to make sure that the debt problem is resolved, and that can take a little time because you're dealing with creditors' internal processes for approving restructuring of debt. In some cases with creditors who aren't used to doing this and don't have well-developed processes, and this can take some time. But the Sri Lankan authorities have made, I think, tremendous progress with consulting with their creditors, and we're hopeful for resolution in the near future of that dimension of the program. And once that is resolved, it can move forward fairly quickly.
Mark Flanagan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, to the big economic questions facing this country and others teetering on the brink of acute debt distress. I'm joined by Azusa Kubota, the resident representative of the UN's Development Programme in Sri Lanka, and Charitha Subasinghe, who is the president of retail at John Keel's Holdings, one of Sri Lanka's largest companies. Good evening. Thank you both for joining us. First of all, Keel's, biggest conglomerate, is involved in all the major economic areas in Sri Lanka, and you also do support of small food projects, support of producers. But what have been and still are some of the obstacles, the biggest obstacles in Sri Lanka getting back on its feet?
I think the most important thing is where we are today, where the inflation is reached a 90% increase against last year, leading to the food inflation, which is the most critical element, which has moved a normal family not being able to handle their 3 meals. Malnutrition to all that is impacting. In addition to that, you have the fiscal policy changes that is impacting the utility.
I mean, it's interesting because you're one of the country's leading businessmen.
Sure.
You are also involved in the development program from the UN,
Sure.
so it's a different sector.
Sure.
But can you put your hand in your heart and say there's good enough governance within Sri Lanka?
It can improve significantly.
Yeah.
I think that is the important thing. The learnings that we have had, not repeating those mistakes is the important thing.
And some kind of fiscal, what was it, stringency, perhaps say. I mean, I was speaking to somebody who runs a big sales company, sales for boats, saying that his employees weren't paying tax until recently. I mean,
Sure.
Even the tax base isn't recognized properly.
Sure. I think that is going to be the most important thing in the recovery phase, whether we get the IMF funding to all that. How do we have proper governance so that no repetition happens thereafter?
Assistant Kubota, you have just arrived, just in position from the 3rd of January, but you've worked all over. You worked in Senegal, you've worked in the Maldives, but you see here that 26% of the country is in need of humanitarian aid. What does a delay, day by day, in an IMF deal do?
Obviously, the poorest households are hurting the most because they already have very limited coping mechanisms. Families are dipping into their savings to pay for their bills, and the longer-term implications of lack of nutrition, lack of schooling, immunization has to be taken into account. And these households require immediate buffer help. And any delay in socioeconomic interventions within the framework of humanitarian response would have long-lasting impact. Given that Sri Lanka has done so well in terms of human development, it was a beacon of hope in the region in terms of progress towards sustainable development goals, human development. We have to make sure the regression will be minimized at this point, especially for the poorest households.
So, in terms of a development program for Sri Lanka that you've, as I say, you've just arrived, what will be the key thing that you'll be doing in the next 6 months?
We'll be looking at immediate responses and longer-term reform agenda. We believe that the COVID has taught us that every crisis presents an opportunity to look into reform requirements, and tax reform is one. It has to be helping the generation of economy and growth for the real people on the ground. It cannot be just looking at the systems and checks and balances, but also how do we look at loopholes and so forth.
But even if a lot is done, you're still facing huge fuel costs, costs for pesticides, costs for fertilizers. You might be able to put food on the table, but it's going to be very expensive still.
It is. It will continue to be expensive simply because the devaluation of the rupee from 203 to 370 had a significant impact because almost 70% of food and beverage products are imported or has an element of import products in it. Give the confidence for further investment income generation methods have to increase as well, because the cost of living is so high. So the income generation for an average household has to increase if they are to fund their basic requirements.
Now, you know, obviously among the protesters and activists, there's deep concerns over the competency of this government. And there is a concern that the IMF, of course, has checks and balances when it does a bailout. But actually the best use might not be made of the money, and that actually is there a danger of throwing good money after bad?
Well, I think the governance structure is going to be important, irrespective of which government is in power, so that there's a further accountability in place that will allow non-repetition in the future.
When, yes, Susie.
No, just wanted to say that as UNDP, we will be and we continue to work with institutions and partners on anti-corruption efforts, modernization of public services through digital transformation, and also justice sector reform. And these long-term governance-related reforms are very much needed to boost social contact between people and the institutions, and also the public, and to bring about investments to Sri Lanka.
But it looks as if there could be as many as 20 countries, that's the assessment, in the same position or approaching the same position as Sri Lanka. You know, what does the UN do in that situation? You know, obviously the richer countries will be asked to pay more money into the UN, but actually is there a danger that actually you become overwhelmed?
Well, luckily we have a system in place to collect data, rapid assessment, so we know where the most vulnerable people are and how they are faring and what kind of immediate support needed. For us, it's very important to have that very clear focus around the most vulnerable segments of the population.
Thank you both very much indeed. It's 6 months since the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, resigned, fleeing the country after a wave of protests erupted over his mismanagement of the economy. It was the younger generation who led the movement known as Aragalaya, which means uprising, which brought about historic change. But the pace of change has slowed, not least because of the risk of detention for 18 months without access to legal recourse, as we discussed, under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. I've been speaking to some of the people who've been at the heart of it all to ask them what for them comes in the aftermath of the uprising. There are stark reminders of last year's uprising strewn in Colombo, some say left by the government as a warning. 9 months on, a protest this week by fewer than 50 people was met by overwhelming numbers of police and army and quickly petered out. Last summer, at the height of the uprising, tens of thousands took to the streets of the capital in increasingly violent clashes. On April the 3rd, protests erupted here in Independence Square, led by young Sri Lankans like Nusli Hameen, a civil engineer who graduated in Bristol and who'd been back working in Colombo for 8 years.
When it comes to a mass protest, like at least 1,000, 2,000 people, or when it comes to like people started like chanting and stuff, that's where they started like tear gassing and water cannon and stuff. Even until yesterday. Right now, after July, especially the Ranil Wickremesinghe's coming to power, you can't even do a silent protest. They would just bring up water cannons and tear gas. I would remember one incident where I was like covered up with all tear gas and somebody had to drag me and pour me water. Otherwise, I think that would be the end of me anyways.
Really? It was that bad?
It was that bad.
Minal Wickrematunge is an artist who comes from a long line of activists in her family. She and other women of a rights group called the Fearless Collective created a mural at the site of the protests addressing the future they wanted to see. So what does she make of the political situation now?
There's this eternal chess game that we're constantly playing between powers, and I always see a cycle of violence happening. It's just the same faces, and it's just a rotation of the same politics, really, with different faces. So I don't see, unfortunately, I don't see someone out there who's someone I want to see as a leader.
Faraz Shoktole is a veteran political commentator on Sri Lankan television. He has watched as increasing numbers of young Sri Lankans have started to leave their country.
Sri Lanka needs its brains. When you couple that with the limited number of university spaces in this country and higher education, further education spaces in the country, then you're looking at a very serious problem.
Now, Newsley can't find any employment as a civil engineer. He believes his role in the uprising has made him a marked man.
Seems like even though the country needs me, but the politician doesn't need me at all.
So you're going to leave?
I don't think there is any other option for me left.
This was a protest led by a younger generation.
Yeah.
But what happens if that younger generation leaves?
And this is a really scary thing, quite frankly, is that if we don't find ways of really giving into some of the demands of the younger people, how long are we going to sit around and really wait for a country that I'm not sure is willing to budge or love you back?
There's no doubt that Sri Lankans love their country, but can politicians, business leaders, civic leaders and activists work together to make sure this bankrupt state does not become an ungovernable one? I'm joined again by Jana de Souza. Jana, you're not going, you're staying. So you still think it's possible to make a change?
I do. I think this current moment presents an opportunity for the leaders that are in power right now to turn things around. However, I don't see that happening, and I feel like it's the younger generation, if at all, that will make that change that we want to see.
I mean, you have been an activist, but can you see actually taking a political role in the future?
Possibly, but as of now, in this current political culture, definitely not. It's a thought of throwing your life away by trying to engage in the politics that we see in Sri Lanka at the moment.
But if the protests do prove to be a catalyst for change, what would you like to see in Sri Lanka in 10 years' time? What kind of country do you want it to be?
In 10 years' time, I hope by then we've done away with executive presidency and all these draconian laws like the likes of the PTA. I hope we have an educated voter base that is voting for candidates who have come into power based on meritocracy and not nepotism. And I hope we have a government that prioritizes the protection of our ecosystems and natural resources.
Jana de Souza, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's just about all we have time for tonight on this edition of Newsnight Global from Sri Lanka. We end this evening with the words of Shihan Karunatilaka, the acclaimed Sri Lankan author and 2022 Booker Prize winner. Writing exclusively for this program, here's his reminder of just how much this country has been through and what remains at stake. Good night.
First came the power cuts, then the gas ran out, then the queues began, and then the people took to the streets. Sri Lanka's economic collapse wasn't unexpected, though few predicted that it would unify a nation and dismantle a government. The young, the poor, the angry and the fed up occupied public spaces, shouted down their rulers, stormed the state's buildings, and sent a president fleeing. Today the queues may have shortened and the tourists may have returned, but real change is yet to come. While the rich turned on the lights and celebrated the new year, for most of the country, the struggle was far from over. With soaring prices and dwindling incomes, many families can no longer afford to feed themselves, school their children, pay their rent. Will the country turn itself around, or will it continue to plummet? No one appears to have clear answers, a clear plan or a clear pathway, but ordinary Sri Lankans who pride themselves on their resilience, their fortitude and their compassion. They know that the one thing this nation cannot afford to run out of is hope.